Belle's been missing for a while now.
Popular online blogger Isabel McKenzie, aka BestBitch93, has mysteriously disappeared. The 25-year-old has more than 7 million subscribers to her YouTube vlog about beauty, fashion and lifestyle.
Our foremost priority at this stage with this information is to stop the posts. The severe social media frenzy was causing a bottleneck in our highly sophisticated copper network.
Bring our bitch back, bring our bitch back.
Where is she? God!
Bring our bitch back, bring our bitch back. I'm okay.
Subscribe below.
I'm Jenny Wenham and I'm a professional YouTube coach.
How come the internet can find that J dude or whatever from Serial, but you can't find one of the most popular vloggers in the world?
This is anonymous.
Oh my God, Derek!
Stop using my name.
We present to you the Fizz a Bitch Up Challenge. I'm BestBitch93 and we're rolling. And we are rolling.
Despite that, I've got absolutely no idea who she is.
Please join me in welcoming Naomi Klein.
So brace yourself, I'm going to get specific and propose a series of interlocking policies. The change may be transformative, but it's anything but vague. We actually know how to do this. It starts with respecting the inherent rights and title of the original caretakers of our countries. Indigenous communities have been at the forefront. Indigenous communities have been at the forefront of protecting rivers, coasts, forests, and lands from out-of-control industrial activity, and they still are, from the Alberta tar sands in my country to the ill-fated Carmichael mine in your country. We can all bolster this crucial role and begin to repair our relationship by fully implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which requires that that mining companies and any actors have prior and informed consent before any activity takes place on Indigenous lands. Caring for one another and caring for the planet could be the economy's fastest growing sectors. Many more people could have higher wage jobs with fewer work hours, leaving us ample time to enjoy our loved ones and flourish in our communities. The latest research out of Stanford University shows us that it's feasible for us to power our economies with 100% renewable energy in the next 20 to 30 years. We could have a 100% clean economy here in Australia, where I live in Canada, by mid-century, not by the end of the century, as our leaders are meaninglessly pledging. If this is possible, if the technology is there, it means there's no longer an excuse for building any new infrastructure projects that lock us into increased extraction decades into the future. That's why the iron law needs to be, when you're in a hole, stop digging. No new coal mines. But more than that, since we are capable of powering our lives without poisoning anyone, the very idea, that racist notion of the sacrifice zone belongs in the dustbin of history next to manifest destiny. No new infrastructure projects, and This is not just about changing where we get our energy. It's also about changing who profits from the generation of energy, how it is produced, changing our economic system. This is often called energy democracy. What it means is that wherever possible, communities should collectively control the renewable energy that they are generating, control it democratically, keep the profits in their community to pay for services. And this is what's really been working in Germany, which is now getting 30% of its electricity from renewables, 80% on a sunny day. They have created 400,000 good jobs. Tell that to Tony Abbott, who says that you have to choose between jobs and the environment. But they've done this by taking back control over their energy grids, voting in big cities like Hamburg to reverse the privatization of their energy systems because they believe that the profit motive is standing in their way. And the other principle should be that Indigenous people, particularly in countries like Australia, should be first to receive public support to own their own clean energy projects. So should communities currently dealing with the heavy health impacts of polluting industrial activities. Yesterday's sacrifice zones need to be transformed into today's super empowerment zones. If we generate power this way, it doesn't merely light our homes, it redistributes wealth, it deepens our democracy, it strengthens our economy, and it starts to heal the wounds in a very tangible way that date back to our country's founding. This is what climate justice looks like. Now, it also means an end to corporate trade deals that give corporations the power to interfere with our attempts to rebuild our local economies, to regulate corporations, to stop damaging extractive projects. Under these trade rules, provinces and states that have banned fracking are facing trade challenges. Germany is facing a huge trade challenge for its energy transition, being sued for 4.7 billion euros by a private company that says that this transition, which is the kind of transition that we all need to embrace, is standing in the way of their right to earn profits from coal and nuclear. We simply cannot afford to allow trade to trump the planet. So, now a lot of people say, well, we can't afford it. But we can afford it. We live in a time of unprecedented prosperity, and we just need to release that money. We can do it, as Australia has in the past, with carbon taxes, with higher royalty rates on extraction, with financial transaction taxes. We need to invest in the public sphere on a massive scale to protect ourselves from the heavy weather we've already locked in, but also because so much public sector work and so much caregiving work, healthcare, teaching, this is already low carbon work. Artists are low carbon workers, not just the people who put up solar panels. We need to embrace this. We need to enlarge these parts of our economy. We need to redefine what a green job is. One thing is certain. It is long past time to declare that austerity, which has systematically attacked these low carbon sectors, to declare that austerity is a fossilized form of thinking that has become a threat to life on Earth. We can pay for this. So we humans are all these things, the people who turn away, choosing not to see what is right in front of us, and the people who reach across vast oceans to help, the people who throw away so casually, and the people who care so much it hurts. We are all of it. Both sides of us are real. But we have a culture that systematically tries to suppress that caring part of ourselves while actively encouraging the careless part. So the task is to build a culture that does the opposite, that encourages the caring and discourages the careless. The path is clear, it's exciting, it's difficult as hell, but we must always remember this: difficult is not the same as impossible. Huge social movements have changed the world before through a magical combination of culture, theory, spirituality, policy, and law. We can do it again. We will be told it's impractical, unrealistic, unserious, making the perfect the enemy of the good, as if perfect didn't leave the station at the Rio Earth Summit more than 20 years ago, all of that. But I want to end with some words from Nauru, which is not just a prison camp, not just a nation racked with economic and political scandal. It's also a country looking into the abyss. They come from Marlene Moses, who has long served as Nauru's ambassador to the UN. She said this in 2012. She was speaking in her capacity of representing not just Nauru, but all small island nation states. She said this: as leaders, we have a responsibility to fully articulate the risks our people face. If the politics are not favorable to speaking truthfully, then clearly we must devote more energy to changing the politics. Clearly, we must. This is our sacred duty to those our countries have harmed in the past, to those suffering needlessly in the present, and to all those who have a right to a safe and bright future. Now is not the time for small steps. Now is the time for boldness. Now is the time to leap. Thank you.
My question is to you, Peter. If you could go back, would you do everything the same? Are you glad that you told that story, or do you wish that you just never went to Egypt?
Look, that assumes that I'd have a choice. Would I do anything differently knowing what I know now? No, I don't think I would have. You know, and in a funny way, I've got a lot to thank the Egyptians for. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. I don't mean this facetiously, and I don't mean it in a glass half full kind of way. I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy what we went through in prison. It was a horrible, terrifying experience. But equally, if our case has done anything, it's brought you lot out here to listen to a talk today about journalistic freedom. It's right up there. And to my mind, as I've just been saying, this is under attack This is something that we need to defend. And journalism gets a really bad rap at the moment. Everyone gets very cynical about journalists. I think the reputation of journalists is right up there with used car salesmen.
And politicians.
And politicians. If we have an opportunity and what this case has done is made people understand and think about why what we do is important to our democracy. It's kind of helped strip away some of the cynicism just for a few moments. I understand where it comes from. I'm not trying to excuse some of the excesses of our business. But the reason I wrote those letters in the first place was because I wanted to frame this as the defence of something fundamental to democracy, something as a defence of a fundamental right. And because I now have a stage and a microphone and audiences, then I think it's been able to turn that into something much more productive. I'm still very concerned. My primary role is still to try and get my colleagues out of prison and to clear our names. But in the process, I do feel, as I said, that something positive has come from this, and I really hope we can keep this conversation going.
And what's amazing is the statistics that we have just based on offenders. And I just wanted to read this because to me this gives you a portrait of the American prison system. The incarceration rate, which is the proportion of adults in prison, I think in Australia it's 165 or 180 per 100,000. In the United States, among white men, the incarceration rate is 480 per 100,000. The incarceration rate among black men is 3,000 per 100,000. And the incarceration rate in the United States among young black men who have not graduated from high school is 35,000 per 100,000. And that's the portrait of our prison system and our society. And maybe instead of sending young black men to prison, we should ensure that they get an education. And education is one of the best predictors of whether you're going to go to prison or not.
If you associate an emotional experience as a child with the product, like in America it's going to the ball game with your dad and having a Coke, that will ingrain and sort of be embedded in your psyche as you get older, so that when you have your own disposable income, you will buy that product. And it's no different here. I mean, my cousin's only 11, she's a cricketer in Perth, and Powerade pay her $1,000 a year. She has to only drink Powerade at her cricket games. Now, this is a drink with 8 teaspoons of sugar in it that maybe if you've run a marathon, it might be okay for you. But if you're playing sedentary cricket at under 11s...
Especially in the outfield.
There's not a lot of sweat going on, I can tell you. You don't need that drink. You know, but she loves it because she feels like Michael Clark or LeBron James.
She's sponsored.
She tells all her friends, I'm a sponsored athlete. This is the insidious nature of what's going on here.
Smart.
That's what we need to stop.
The pictures of that little boy this week, I mean, you can't look, but you can't look away. And, I read in the Guardian today, it just said, this one boy, I can't remember the headline verbatim, but it was just like, this one boy shows us everything that's wrong with the refugee crisis. Now, if you wanted to try to explain Syria to me, if you're a foreign policy analyst, I have a spare 5 days. If you could talk constantly to me for 5 days, then maybe you can explain to me that multilateral conflict, because I'm not quite on top of it. I don't think many people are. And as sad as what happened to that poor little chap is, I mean, it's devastating, but it doesn't explain everything about the refugee crisis. And this is supposed to be the fucking Guardian, It's supposed to be it's supposed to be a storied newspaper of level-headed record, and it's fucking BuzzFeed.
Okay.
And, hashtag brave and hashtag so brave, and I care more than you. No, you don't really care. And we say that the problem is that we live in a competitive capitalist environment, but we're still sort of showing our fetish item of compassion. Mine's bigger than yours. I mean, come on. There's something very broken. So no, I don't think that there's anything wrong with compassion in itself.
Human beings have an innate need to bond and connect. And if you're happy and healthy, you will bond and connect with the people around you. But if you can't do that because you're isolated or traumatized or cut off from meaning, or your culture hasn't told you how to find a meaningful life, you're going to bond and connect with something that gives you some sense of relief. That might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be alcohol, that might be ice. But you will bond with something because that is our nature. 85% of people who use ice don't become addicted. It's a very similar figure for all drugs, right? You are being told a full story that this is a ferocious chemical. It's very interesting. There's a long history of this, right? The 18th century in London, in Britain, huge numbers of people were driven out of the countryside into these disgusting urban slums, and loads of them became alcoholics. They turned to gin. And it was claimed that gin was this evil drug that hijacks people, that takes them over. Actually, it was very widely reported and very widely believed that if you drank too much gin, you would spontaneously combust. And if we look at that and think that's crazy, I want to point out that in this country, it is widely reported in your media and widely stated as a fact by your Prime Minister and your chief police officers that taking ice gives you, and these are their words, superhuman strength, right? Let's think about that for a second. If there was in fact a drug that could make humans superhuman, I think we'd all be quite interested in it, right? It's like we live in a Marvel comic, And this magical thinking, now when we think about gin, everyone who came to this walked past somewhere that sold gin, and you were not hijacked and you were not taken over, and you didn't go in and buy a bottle and down, maybe some of you did, but I doubt it, go in and down a bottle, right? The reason isn't because anyone was stopping you. It's because you wanted to be present in your life. It's because you want to hear me and hear me. But more importantly, you have jobs you love, you have people you love, you have things you want to do. That's the core of addiction. It's about not being able to bear to be present in your life. So if we want to understand why there's a meth crisis in Australia, we've got to ask ourselves, why are there so many of your fellow citizens who cannot bear to be present? Let's think about the indigenous people of Australia, which have been documented to have a much higher rate of addiction. If we think about that, there's this kind of theory that's presented sometimes that Aboriginal peoples can't metabolize alcohol and drugs. There's absolutely no evidence for that. So let's go for that theory. There's one. On this side, they can't metabolize it. The other is we, and I do mean we because I'm British, subjected them to a genocide, and they've had horrific lives ever since, and they're really unhappy. Which of those two explanations seems most plausible to you?
Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. I'm Anne Mossop from the Sydney Opera House and I want to welcome you to our session here, The Right to Die, with Helen Joyce, introduced by the distinguished philosopher Anthony Grayling. My role here is a very brief one. I wanted to say a welcome to the people who are not only in the Drama Theatre today, but in our Fody satellite venues. Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, Blacktown City Libraries, Riverside Theatre in Parramatta, the Museum of the Riverina in Wagga Wagga, the Fire Station Arts Centre in Dubbo, the Brisbane Powerhouse in Brisbane in Queensland, and the Horsham Regional Art Gallery in Victoria. We're delighted that you can join us, and please send us your photographs, your comments on Twitter, and join the conversation. My pleasure now to hand over to Professor A.C. Grayling, who will be introducing our speaker, Helen Joyce.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, we have a really very important topic to discuss today, and the great privilege really to have Dr. Helen Joyce to come and talk to us about it. Helen is an international editor of The Economist magazine. She's Irish. She studied at Trinity College Dublin and then at Cambridge. And for a number of years, she was involved in public understanding of mathematics and statistics. So she does know whereof she speaks. She spent some years in Brazil as the Brazil editor, the bureau chief of The Economist there. And since getting back into the rest of the world as an international editor for The Economist, she's been, of course, covering a large number of topics. She was education correspondent at The Economist for a while also. But just recently, with some colleagues at The Economist, she wrote a very important editorial positioning The Economist in favour of physician-assisted or doctor-assisted dying. Now, I have to declare an interest. I am myself a patron of Dignity in Dying, which is an organisation in the UK that used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, and was involved in drafting a bill for Parliament, which is an ancestor of the bill that's before the UK Parliament at the moment, and just about to be discussed there too. This is a very, very emotive issue. It's a very important one. And I know that people who've had experience of loved ones who have suffered tremendously at the end of lives will have competing views, different views about what should be done, what should be allowed, what we should accord to people who have a desire, make a choice about what happens to them at the end of their lives. So there will be strong feelings in the audience, I know, and I think when we get to the question and answer session after Helen has spoken, we may see that registered in the kinds of questions that are asked. But could I please ask you one thing, and that is to remember what you've just seen about asking questions. It's very tempting, especially with an emotional subject like this, to report personal experiences and to talk at some length about the reasons why one holds the view that one does. But this is an opportunity to put to the test an argument in favour of assisted dying. So please do take that opportunity. So my very great pleasure indeed to introduce to you Dr. Helen Joyce.
So The Economist magazine was founded in 1843, and it was founded to campaign on a single issue, which was to repeal the Corn Laws, which was a set of laws at the time that kept grain out of the country and kept prices high for local suppliers. And 3 years later, those laws were repealed. We didn't just shut up shop and go and do something else. The magazine kept going and it kept campaigning. So in the last 20, 25 years, just to pick out a few subjects that we've campaigned on, we campaigned for gay marriage. Well before anyone else was saying this, we put this on our cover in the 1990s. We are still campaigning to decriminalise prostitution and to decriminalise the taking of all illegal drugs. These are a sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the things that we care about, and I bring out these ones particularly because there are some common themes. The first is this idea that we campaign. People often say, you know, why do you cover the things that you do, and why do you argue for these things? You're called The Economist. Argue for these things. You're called The Economist. I suppose it's a confusing name. They think that we're going to just report on economics. But actually, we were set up to campaign. Second reason that I wanted to highlight these particular issues to you was to point out that things can change really very, very fast sometimes from what's the received wisdom. So when I started The Economist 10 years ago, I don't think anyone really, except us, was arguing for drugs to be decriminalised, except a few fringe groups. We've nearly won that argument now. Marijuana being decriminalised in America, the home of the war on drugs. And people no longer think that it's a ridiculous, far-out idea. Things can change very, very fast. And the editorial we wrote in the 1990s, our first editorial on gay marriage, was written by a gay colleague. And he said at the time, and he wrote, that he was arguing for future generations. He didn't think that he would ever have the chance to marry the man he loved himself. He's married now. And so things can change so fast. Well, what about what we're talking about here today? We got a new editor in February as Annie Minton-Beddoes took over. She's our first female editor. And one of her decisions as editor was to renew this focus on campaigns. And the subject she chose for her first campaign was doctor-assisted dying. Why? Well, it fits with our liberal values. That's the thread that runs through all these examples I gave you. We're a liberal newspaper in the old-fashioned sense of meaning that people should be allowed to do what they want unless we have a rather good reason to stop them. And that good reason might be that they impinge on other people's freedom to do what they want, or that there's some very important public good or general good that stopping them is essential to allow that good thing to happen. But if we don't have a good reason, then we're not going to stop them. Another reason is that there's a lot going on. I know here in Australia there are politicians who are campaigning to introduce assisted dying. You're not alone in this. There are very live campaigns in the UK where we're based, in Canada, in many American states, and in several European countries as well. So it's of the moment. And we are a newspaper, so reporting on what's going on is important to us. Another reason is that's a chance for us to have influence. It really matters. It's a subject that matters, and it's something where there's change is possible right now. And of course, with demography being what it is, as we all grow older, it's becoming an even more important issue for even larger numbers of people. So what are we talking about here? Assisted dying. It's an umbrella term that we're using to cover two things that are given different names and that some people feel are rather different from each other morally. We don't particularly, but anyway. One of them is assisted suicide, so where you kill yourself with help from somebody, presumably a doctor, and that help generally involves writing you a prescription. And the other one is what's called voluntary euthanasia. That word voluntary is essential. So involuntary euthanasia is what the Nazis did, killing people who didn't want to be killed. Voluntary euthanasia is killing somebody who has asked you to do so. So in general, that would be the doctor giving you the drug, maybe intravenously. I don't see a big moral distinction between these two, but as I'll explain, some countries' legal systems do see a big distinction. If we go back not even very long, suicide itself was illegal in most places. And whenever I say this to people, people say, well, what could the possible penalty be? Well, the fact is you could try to kill yourself and fail, and in some places you would be prosecuted for that, and the penalties might include having all your possessions taken from you. Or indeed, if you did manage to kill yourself, that your possessions would become forfeit. It's only in the 1990s that in my own country, Ireland, suicide was decriminalised. There hadn't been a prosecution for ages before that, but it was still on the books. It was only decriminalised last year in India, and it's still illegal in Singapore. Well, when countries decriminalised suicide, many of them introduced a new offence, and that was the offence of assisting a suicide. It's a slightly strange offence because it's generally not illegal to help someone to do something that it's legal for them to do themselves. I can't think of another example, actually. What the thinking, I suppose, is that most people who are considering suicide are not really themselves at the time. They are maybe not a sound mind, they may be depressed, and that the appropriate reaction isn't to help them, it's to give them medical care, maybe to get them into counselling, maybe to get them antidepressants, maybe to at least try and get them to slow down and think. There's also the worry that there could be undue pressure, for example, from people who might want to get a legacy. Or that it might be that suicide, assisting a suicide, was really a cover for murder, that this is not what it looks like being. But one country that had very vague rules about assisted suicide is Switzerland. So when they decriminalised suicide in 1942, they brought in a very, very small restriction on assisting a suicide. They just said that it was illegal to assist a suicide for selfish motives, essentially to get a legacy. And some Swiss doctors, fairly shortly afterwards, started to help some people to die. And in the 1990s, probably the most famous clinic that has anything to do with assisted suicide, Dignitas, started to accept foreigners to come to Switzerland and get help to die. And since then, since 1998, I think it is that they were founded, they've helped over 1,700 foreigners from more than 40 countries to commit suicide. The next development, if we look back through the history of the assisted dying movement, was in Oregon, the American state of Oregon. So in 1997, a law came into force there that allowed doctor-assisted dying, specifically suicide. Voluntary euthanasia is still illegal there, in certain rather tightly controlled circumstances. So the person who wants to die must be less than 6 months from death. That must be confirmed by 2 doctors. So they're terminally ill people. They have to be very carefully screened to make sure that they are of sound mind and that this decision is a fixed decision. And then they will be given a prescription of lethal drugs that they may take themselves. So since then, since 1997, only about 1,400 prescriptions have been written in that time, and only 2/3 of the people who got these lethal prescriptions actually took them. So a very small number of people have actually used that law. Several other American states have similar legislation now, and others are considering it. So California, just in the last few days, a bill that's modelled on the assisted dying law of Oregon, that law has progressed further through their legal system. I don't know if it'll come into force. They've tried several times by now, and some other states are thinking of a similar thing. Now, in the Netherlands, since the 1970s, even though assisting a suicide has been illegal there, they have had a sort of a strange approach, which is very Dutch, which is that even though it's illegal, they're going to tolerate it. This is exactly what they did with marijuana, by the way. It was illegal but tolerated there for decades before they actually changed the law. So there were a lot of campaigning doctors who tested the boundaries of what was legal, and then in 2002 they finally actually wrote a law. And their law goes an awful lot further than Oregon's does. For a start, you don't actually have to be terminally ill. You may be suffering in other ways. You don't have to be able to take the medicine yourself. In Oregon, you do. And interestingly, the large majority of people using the law in the Netherlands ask the doctor to give them the drug intravenously rather than taking the medicine themselves. Belgium introduced a very similar law the following year, and it's moved very fast to extend the boundaries even further than the Netherlands has. Last year, they actually abolished the lower age limit entirely. So now there is no one who's too young for this law to apply to them. So what do we know now? We've had assisted dying laws of different sorts on the books in several different countries for up to 20 years, in Switzerland's case, much longer. The first thing to say is that it's not very much used. So as I said, in Oregon, only about 1,000 people have taken this sort of drugs in the 20 years nearly since the law was passed. And since it was meant to be something that was helping people to die, if that's what they wanted, that's really a rather small number and suggests that perhaps the law is rather overly tightly defined. In Belgium, so Belgium's a country of 2 parts, like there's a French-speaking part and a Dutch-speaking part, and the Dutch-speaking part is culturally much more similar to the Netherlands. In that part of Belgium, actually 5% of deaths are now assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia. I've heard this number quoted as if it's really rather large. I don't think it is. I mean, dying is something that we all do, and for most of us, the end is not very sudden. So 5% doesn't strike me as something that you would feel, if you decided that this is an okay way to allow people to die, do you think 5% is a lot? But I'd be interested in hearing what you think. The next thing is that it's mostly about terminal cancer. Even in the Netherlands and in Belgium, where the law is open to people who aren't even actually terminally ill, it's generally used by people who are close to death, and it's generally cancer. And then the next thing that's interesting to say is that it's not actually about pain, especially if you haven't got this sort of law on the statute books in your own country, or if you haven't given it a great deal of thought. You think that this is about agony, terminal agonies. Well, we have got a lot of medication that can control pain, even very great pain towards the end. It's not always used as well as it may be. There are people who die in a great deal of pain. But actually, that's not the reason that's cited in any of the countries, mostly. It's what you might call existential suffering, is what people talk about. So people say that they feel they've had their lives are over, and there's just a bit at the end that they now have to get through, and they don't want to. It's a bit where they're maybe lonely, where they feel pointless. They may have feelings of helplessness, of lack of control, lack of dignity. If you are extremely ill, if you are close to death, I'm sure I'm not the only person here who has been close to somebody who's died. Most of us will have been. You'll know that it's not just pain that people suffer from. So they suffer from knowing the situation, but they also suffer from many, many other indignities like constant exhaustion or not being able to control their bodily functions or having permanently lost their appetite or being unable to just generally do anything, move. It's a great topic, this one, isn't it? I really have them rolling in the aisles with this one. So 5%, is 5% a lot? Do you mind if I just ask you to put your hands up and tell me if you think 5% is a lot of all deaths to be suicides or assisted dying? So yeah, okay, so some people are putting their hands up. Who thinks that it would probably end up even higher than that if the law... Okay, all right, I don't have to do much persuading then. People who are against assisted suicide, in particular doctors, so doctors' organisations in most places are actually against any of this sort of law. California's Medical Association has just dropped its opposition, in fact. But in the UK, the BMA, the British Medical Association, is very strongly opposed to introducing any such law. They say that it's not needed, and they say it's not needed for several reasons, one being that palliative care can control suffering at the end of life. Now, is that so? As I said, there are pain medications that one can use at the end of life. They aren't always used very effectively. So one of my colleagues, when we were preparing this material, did come by to say that she had just been to see an old friend who was in hospice and was very close to death from cancer. And it was quite clear that the pain was coming and going in waves and that he was quite inwardly focused trying to manage it. So, okay, maybe the medication is there, but maybe it's not always used as it might be. But the other thing that they say, doctors, is that, so the other thing to say, I mean, about palliative care is that it's not like that gets you where you want to be. I talked to a British sociologist called Clive Seal, and he went to a talk by an opponent of assisted dying, and they said, well, if everyone was in hospice, the demand would vanish. And he thought, that's actually a question I can answer empirically. So he surveyed people in British hospice who had terminal cancer and also those in hospital who had terminal cancer. And he found that actually those in hospice were more likely to say that they would consider assisted suicide, were more likely to have researched it, and were more likely to say that they should be allowed to do it. And that's a very unexpected result. And why would that be? What he said in the end was that if you're in hospice, you're someone who's thinking about the situation, you're thinking about the fact that you are going to die and you've accepted that, and you're planning, you've looked at your options, you've chosen hospice. Many people are in denial, or they maybe it hasn't been fully communicated to them that they are close to death. Those are the people who aren't going to think of assisted suicide. So it's not the case, if you hear it said that palliative care and hospice can take away the demand for assisted suicide, that's not actually true. 5%. The other reason that I don't think 5% is very high is that doctors actually act all the time to hasten death. There's a wide range of ways they do that. One way is by withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. That may be very aggressive treatment, for example, if you're someone who's on a ventilator, or it may be actually food and drink towards the end of life are withheld. Second reason is that pain management, when the pain is very intense, can shorten life too. And correctly, doctors generally prioritise the management of the pain rather than the extension of the life. And the third reason is that in the last 10 or 15 years, a thing called terminal sedation has become much, much more commonly used. Towards the end of life, people aren't only in pain, they can sometimes be very distressed and unable to communicate what it is they want and confused. And it can come to the stage that there's really nothing much you can do for them except to calm them right down with sedative. And then this can be that this is something that just continues for a few days and the person sort of naturally slips away, and you may withhold food and drink during this as well. This is a way a lot of people die nowadays. I couldn't tell you any numbers because nobody has counted them. We don't have any good data on how people die, where they are. We know where they are, mostly in hospital, now, more and more in hospital now, but we don't know how they die, how the decisions were made towards the end. One of the great privileges of having written about this subject is that a lot of people have shared with me their knowledge and their experiences of end-of-life situations. I've never written anything that so many people have knocked on my office door or have sent me long emails about or have even phoned me to talk through things. And it has become clear to me that basically people either aren't thinking about this at all, or they're thinking about it and actually quite strongly outraged, have strong opinions on one side or the other. And if you forgive me, I have a sort of an analogy that maybe sounds tasteless to some of you, and that's childbirth. If you go back about a century, in Britain anyway, and I'm sure in a lot of other countries, you didn't talk about what childbirth was like. And women who had their first babies were often in quite significant ignorance about what was going to happen. I remember reading a book in which a woman who just had a baby was described, and I'll never forget the exact phrase that was used. It said that she was feeling a bit sorry for herself. You don't say. She's just gone through natural childbirth without any pain relief, and you didn't tell her what was coming, and now she's feeling a bit sorry for herself. So, people were two camps. Either you knew what you were talking about, possibly only too well. No men were in this camp except a few doctors. Or you really didn't know. You might know that actually this is very dangerous. A lot of people, of course, used to die in childbirth. And we're kind of in that situation now, unfortunately, when it comes to the end of life. Because we don't do it at home anymore, and because, thankfully, not so many children die anymore as they used to, most of us haven't seen it unless we've seen it. Do you know what I mean? Like, either you know only too well how this isn't what you thought it was going to be like, or you actually just don't know. And the result is that those of us who don't know, well, we can say quite ignorant things, and we can kind of shut ourselves off from thinking about this. So we did do some polling on attitudes to go with this editorial that we did in June. We polled people in 15 countries on their attitudes towards assisted dying. The results were very interesting, but maybe not quite what they seem on the headline. Australia was one of those countries, and you were very much like most of the rest of the countries we polled, which were European countries, US, Canada, Japan, Russia. There were strong majorities in most countries in favour of legalising doctor-assisted dying in some form. I think Russia was the only country that there wasn't, and Poland was borderline. Interestingly, we then said, well, how? So how do you want it to be legalised? Do you want the doctor to be allowed to give you the medicine, or do you want to have to take it yourself? And about up to 10% of all people went no, neither of those. It's like, well, you've just said you wanted to legalise it, you don't want to do it anyway. So first off, this just shows people aren't maybe thinking very hard about this issue. And we then asked them in what circumstances. So very strong support for allowing people to have assisted dying in situations of intolerable physical suffering, not just pain, suffering. And then that support drops away when you talk about people who are under 18, and the younger you go, the more. The support drops off, or people who are suffering mentally. Questions that I think, and that I know from experience from the things that people have come and talked to me about, 3 specific questions that I know people find very hard. And one of them is this question of children, and one of them is the question of mental suffering, and the third question I want to really look at specifically is whether allowing assisted dying in some form devalues what we might call difficult lives. So difficult lives meaning people who are disabled in some way. Are we saying that they're in some way less worthwhile human beings? I'll take them in this order. I think I'm going to talk about children first. So it seems that when those of us, the population at large, are asked, do you think doctors should be allowed to help you die in some circumstances, people would sort of reflexively mostly say yes. And I was talking about this just yesterday to somebody here. It's like the way many of us sort of reflexively say, oh, I don't want to have to go into a nursing home, or I don't want to die in hospital, just shoot me. I don't know if you've ever said that, but people really do say that. Or they say, I just want to be put down like a dog or something. They really do say this. I'm not making this up. I think that's showing, A, that the starting point is that people don't have an instinctive feeling that you shouldn't have control over this aspect of your lives, but B, that they're not thinking very hard, and C, that they don't want to. The fact is, no one is going to shoot you. No one is going to put you down when it comes to it. You may well die in hospital. You may well go into a nursing home. We all know this when we think about it, because we see what happens when we look around us, and we don't want it. People don't want to die in hospital. They don't want to go into a nursing home, and they don't want the end of their lives to be very drawn out. But we feel powerless to stop it, and we don't know what to do about it, so we just don't talk do about it, so we just don't talk about it and we don't think about it. We sort of cut it off by saying, oh, just put me down, and then on we go. Well, when it comes to kids, it's the other way around. Our reflexive, instinctive thing to say is, no, of course not. That's a terrible thing. You know, how could you even think of shortening a child's life? It's the most awful thing. Well, the reason you might think about it is because children also suffer and die. And we all know this too. We just very badly don't want to think about it. I think the best thing about living now and not living a century ago is that very few children die. And there's literally nothing that development means that's more important than that. Sadly, a few still do. So children do get cancer and they do die and they do suffer. And if we say that in that situation we would be willing to allow an adult to shorten the last few weeks, the last few days, I cannot see why we would stop a child from doing that. People say, well, how would you decide? They're children. Well, the fact is that when children are very, very ill and when they're dying, extremely difficult decisions already have to be made. Any child who's terminally ill, the decisions that have to be made already will have included when to stop trying treatments that have no chance of success or very little chance of success. They may have included deciding whether to try an amputation to see if that will stop the spread of an illness. All of these things will already have had to be decided, and we know, if you're a paediatrician, if you work in this end-of-life care for children, you already have a procedure for doing this. Things are decided between the children, the parent, and the doctor. They're decided on evidence. They're decided in discussion. Depending on the child's age or the situation of the parents, different weights are given to different people's opinions. I just don't see that there is a bright line between those already extremely difficult decisions and this last one. But the rest of us don't want to think about this because we're so lucky we don't have to. That's why I would argue for any law on assisted dying not to have a lower age limit, but I would of course say that the child had to be terminally ill. I'll explain why I wouldn't make that restriction for adults and why I would for children. So the second one is this idea of mental suffering. Clearly people from the polling results are very, very uncomfortable with the idea of allowing doctor-assisted dying for people who are suffering mentally rather than physically. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and some of them are rather good ones. I think the good reason is that, again, one thing we all know, and maybe we've started to talk about more recently, but still don't talk about enough, is a lot of people will go through a depressive patch at some point in their lives. Depression's really common. And most of us who go through depression, we come out of it and we're glad to be alive again. And most people who try to kill themselves and fail are glad they failed and don't try again. So what we're afraid of is normalizing suicide in any way or helping people to do something that if they could just have been helped to just cope for a little bit longer, they'd have come out the other end and they'd be glad that we'd helped them. This is very hard to answer. I mean, these are good points, genuinely. You do not want people at the very low point of something that's going to turn around, making a decision that obviously is one they can't reverse. And you don't want to normalise the idea that suicide is just, you know, something that you might consider doing, or that it's even brave, or that you... I mean, people who are suicidal or depressed often say they're a burden on other people. You don't want them to think that being a burden means you should get rid of yourself and not be that burden anymore. But then on the other hand, if you're suffering physically but not suffering mentally, I'm not even sure what that means. And suffering is mental. If you're not suffering mentally, you're not suffering. It's something that's experienced, it's something that's lived. And you can arguably, the law in Oregon, which is very strict on this, if you show, you must be interviewed and they must decide that you're not mentally ill, in particular that you're not depressed. If you're depressed, they won't give you the medication. And a lot of people are turned away on this ground. So there's this strange situation whereby if you're terminally ill, probably with cancer, that's what most of the people who use the law in Oregon are, but you're coping unbelievably well, and you're able to be really cheerful when you're interviewed by the doctor, they'll give you the medication. But if this is the moment at which you realise that everything, that your life wasn't what you'd hoped it to be, that now it's over, and you sink into just despair, they won't give you the medication. So, again, I'd be very interested in hearing what you think about this. Do you think that it's possible? I do, but do you think it's possible to draw a law, to draw the boundaries, or to have procedures for a law that doesn't in any way normalise suicide for people who are in a transient state of suffering, but not lock out people who are in, I think, what must be the most appalling situation, to be terminally ill and to feel despair, and to be turned away because you feel despair? It's a good point, I think, here to address two issues that came up when I was doing my reporting and when I was talking to colleagues about all of this. And the first one is why doctors? Why doctors we want to help? And the second one is why suffering at all? Why are we talking about suffering here? So there's a member of our House of Lords in the UK, Laura Finlay, Baroness Laura Finlay, who's a very senior doctor. She's either still currently the president of the British Medical Association, or she may just have finished her term as president, I'm not sure. And she's a very strong opponent of any sort of assisted suicide legislation. I interviewed her for the piece, and her opinions are important because she is a palliative care specialist, so she has been with a lot of people when they've died. And she's against the whole idea for several reasons, but specifically she says that doctors shouldn't be in this role. Doctors are people that we give a great deal of authority to, and they're listened to with great attention, and they're listened to for what they don't say as well as for what they do say. So she says often people say to their doctors things like, oh, just put me down now. This put me down is such a theme. And what they want is they want the doctor to say, no, it's not that bad. No, I can help you. No, I can make sure that you don't suffer pain. They're eliciting, they're afraid to just ask you. They're afraid to just say, how bad is this going to get? How long do I have? They maybe don't think they're going to get an honest answer. They're very afraid. They want comfort from you. But she says that if you are going to allow anything in the way of assisted suicide, it should not be the doctor, it should be done through the court system. You could go, for example, to the family courts and you could say, I fit within the terms of the legislation, whatever the legislation is, and then the court could order a prescription to be written from you, which you could pick up from some depot or something. I don't think this works. And the reason I don't think it works, well, you're able to kill yourself. You don't have to go to anyone, I know that. But we control lethal substances, and the way that we control them is via our doctors. Doctors are specifically the people who are allowed to prescribe things that the rest of us can't get without a doctor's prescription. So in a world where we had no doctors and we had no medical profession, you would just be able to go and get the poison. I mean, that's what Juliet did when she wanted to die because Romeo didn't love her anymore. She just went and got poison. We can't do that because doctors are there to do that. So I think you have to do it via doctors. And the other one is, who else is talking to you about what your options are? Like, who else is going to tell you what your situation is? I understand this business that patients are afraid to talk to their doctors, but I think that comes back to the more general problem that we do not talk enough about death. We are not open enough about this. That has to change. I totally agree about that. So that's my answer to the why doctors. Now, the why suffering, this one was quite an interesting one. So when I've been working on this article for months and months. I was asked to coordinate correspondence around the world and to put together the reporting and then to write the leader with it. And then towards, when we knew we had a date for publication, it was discussed in one of our editorial meetings in London. And anyone can go, everyone's expected to go really, and anyone can chip in. And so I laid out the line of what I wanted to write in the leader, and I was very heavy on the personal choice and autonomy, and this being very much the economist's values. And one of my colleagues, a young economist, he said, Helen, I don't understand the role of suffering at all in the argument you've made. And I'm sorry, this is a bit flippant of him, but what he really said was, he said, I might be feeling very down about the state of Greece's economy. And I say to myself, I'm going to kill myself. I feel so down about that. Why would I not be allowed to go to a doctor and ask for a prescription in that situation? And of course, nobody does this. It's a hypothetical, but it actually gave me pause, and I thought, I'm not sure what the role for suffering is in this argument, or what the role for suffering is in the legislation. I mean, yes, people are going to use this because they're suffering, but why do we need to say that? And I came back to him afterwards, having thought about it, and I said, totally apart from the argument that the people who will use this are the people who are suffering, it's that we have said, yes, you can kill yourself. We got rid of these laws that say suicide is a criminal act. But now we're talking about something more, which is the state sanctioning it and society saying that we're going to help you in some way, that we're not only not going to stand in your way, but we are going to help you. We do have a right to say in what circumstances we're willing to do that. And we do have a right to write in the legislation what we think is sort of reasonable or natural here. And also, this issue of not normalising suicide or making it more likely that people who are in transient states of despair will use the legislation. I think by writing the law, you can help to frame that understanding. It was an interesting question, though. Some clever colleagues. The third one I wanted to discuss was this issue of whether allowing doctor-assisted dying in some way devalues some people's lives compared with other ones. So the people who have been most vocal in favour of doctor-assisted dying and the people who've gone to court or the people who've become campaigners on this are very often people with very severe disabilities. That's not who uses the legislation most. That's really about terminal cancer. But the most heart-rending cases are people, for example, with motor neurone disease. And these are people who know, who can see ahead of them, who know that their condition is going to deteriorate. Mentally, they're still going to be fine, but a point is going to come when they are completely physically disabled, paralysed from the neck down, possibly unable to speak, and that then they will die rather slowly over some time after this. And they know if they wait, they're not going to be able to do anything about it themselves. So quite tragically, some people in this situation have gone early to Switzerland from the UK and from other countries because they're afraid of leaving it too late. So they've wasted and lost a part of a life that they still could have had, which I think is quite appalling. Well, what about people who are in that sort of situation who don't want to die? If we write down in the law any sort of set of conditions in which we think it would be reasonable to help you, and we write down, that your life is very difficult, that you're severely physically disabled or something, are we saying, yeah, we know why someone like that would want to die? That is a lesser life. And where, if you are paralysed, we will help you to die. If you're not paralysed, we won't. Are we, by doing that, saying that paralysed people are less valuable in some sense? And some people feel like that. They feel very strongly. In particular, a lot of disabled organisations campaign against any assisted dying laws, and that's exactly the argument that they use, that it's lessening their value. It's saying that they're less worthwhile people. Against that, interestingly, a lot of disabled people totally disagree. So we didn't poll separately for disabled people, but some countries have asked disabled people specifically as a subgroup within people more generally what they think, and they don't find there's lesser support. And some rather high-profile disabled people themselves have spoken out on this, and Stephen Hawking being an example. So he rather recently said that to keep someone alive against their wishes seems to me to be the ultimate indignity. That was his take on it. He says he doesn't want to kill himself now. He's got plenty of physics still to do. But that if he runs out of ideas and feels like there's nothing left for him, he could really imagine that. I had the great privilege of interviewing a man called Stephen Fletcher for this article. He's a Canadian MP. And 19 years ago, he had what he calls his quintessentially Canadian accident. When he was 23, his car ran into a moose and he broke his neck. And he was for several months unable to even breathe unaided, unable to speak, unable to communicate except by blinking. He is now able to breathe and he's able to speak, but he is still paralysed from the neck down. Since he had his accident, he became an MP. He became a minister. He was transport minister for a couple of years in Canada, and he has campaigned for assisted dying. He has been putting forward a private member's bill. I think it's out of time now, but Canada's actually going to have assisted dying quite soon anyway because of a Supreme Court decision. So his point was that he looks back at those first terrible months when he was completely unable to do anything, even breathe, or unaided. And that's the situation that somebody with motor neurone disease knows is ahead of them. And he still had hope. He was told that there was hope that it would improve, and in fact it did. But if he'd had no hope, he didn't go so far as to say that he would definitely have used it, but he said he should have had the option. That option should have been there for him. So different people in the same circumstances who make profoundly different decisions. I don't think any of us know what we'd do if we were in that situation. I mean, I've asked quite a lot of people, I've told quite a lot of people Stephen Fletcher's story, and most people say, oh, I'd want to die. Actually, they're wrong. It's amazing. We know from people who have had very life-threatening injuries that have drastically changed their physical level of ability. People say beforehand, oh, I could never be happy again, or I would want to die. Actually, a year after the accident, it's quite astounding how people are sort of back to their own selves. So you don't know until it happens to you, but different people make very different decisions in these situations. It looks very different to different people. There isn't an abstract stuff called life that we have to defend or protect or hold sacred. There are only individual lived lives, and those lives are lived by individual people who feel different about things. I know that sounds trite, but do you know the way it is when you spend several months thinking about something, you often circle back to something that you could have said at the beginning, people are different. And you realise, yes, they really are different. That's incredible. Wow, now I know it. So I'm glad I'm getting you to laugh still at the end of this talk. I think that really is a great thing I've managed to do there. So I'm going to tell you a really down story now. The story that I found absolutely hardest, absolutely most heartbreaking in all of this. I cried quite a lot when I was writing this article. I'm not ashamed to say I did have some snivelling sessions. So a young man called Daniel James in the UK, he broke his neck when he was 22 in a rugby scrum. And he really was not able to reconcile himself in any way to this. I think he had a little bit of movement left, and he did try whenever he was given any opportunity to kill himself, but he wasn't able to. And a year after his accident, his parents, when he was 23, accompanied him to Switzerland and stayed with him while he killed himself. He died. And I mentioned this in the article. So when we file our articles, they go into a shared system that anyone can go into, and people are encouraged to have a look if it's a subject they're interested in, and they maybe come by the author's door or the editor's door and make comments if there was a bit they didn't understand or that they felt needed more clarification. And one of my colleagues stopped by and he said, you're just going to have to give more details about that Dan James story because it's completely mad. Those are the words he used, completely mad. He said, obviously, he was seriously depressed, he needed treatment, what were his parents thinking? And then he said some sort of more unkind things about the parents. And then about a half an hour later, another colleague came by and she shared with me some stories that she knew personally, and I said to her, what did you think of the Dan James story? And she said, I'd have gone with him. If he was my son, I'd have gone with him. And because we don't talk about all of this, we don't talk about death, and we don't talk about what you would do in these terrible circumstances, each of us thinks that our position is the natural position. It's like we didn't talk about abortion or childbirth or any of these things, and I don't know that talking about it changes your mind, but it does at least open your eyes to the fact that other people feel profoundly different about these things. I mean, I don't know what it's like here, but do women columnists here write about their childbirth experiences in a very censorious way and say that other women made stupid choices and, either that they're, hippies who wear sandals and eat yogurt and muesli, if they wanted a natural childbirth, or that they're too posh to push if they said they wanted to have cesareans? Because we do this a bit in Britain, and they do it in the US as well. And there's recently been a few women who've called for a truce on this one. So when a woman tells you about her water birth and her, her ball that she used to rotate her hips and so on, and this all sounds awful to you because you had an epidural and that was the best thing ever, you don't say anything except, good for you, not for me. So we know now that people feel differently about these things, and because we've talked about it. So what do I want you guys to do? What does The Economist want you to do? We're campaigning on this. Well, we think the law should be changed. That's what our campaign is. But before that, and importantly for that, I think we need to just start talking more about death and talking about the fact that we are all going to die. It's not going to be that easy for most of us at the end. What are we going to do as a society to make it better? Not just easier, but better. A death can be a good death. That is a possibility. If you have someone you want to talk to about this, I highly recommend Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal. He's a doctor who's a profoundly beautiful thinker and writer. And I've used the book myself in difficult conversations with family members. It's amazing how you can talk about these things and how grateful people are who've been alone and worried and who feel they can't talk about it, how grateful they are if you maybe are able to find a good way to start a conversation. So that's what I'd ask you to do, to talk, to find out what other people think, to get better informed about this, and to start a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Helen. Thank you. For me, the whole issue is one about compassion for people who are suffering and about respect for the autonomy of individuals, and of course the desire that one might have oneself for the option, at least later on. So these are very important points. Now, this is going to be an opportunity for the audience to ask you some questions about this, but I'll kick off with one. And I should just mention to people, by the way, that there are microphones down at the front. If you'd like to ask a question, please come down and form a little queue at the microphones. There are many, many things to talk about, but one thing that rather interests me is the attitude of medical professionals to this. You mentioned the fact that the BMA in the UK is opposed to it. One comment and one question. The comment is, why isn't it open to us to include in this debate the suggestion that there should be a medical specialism, such that perhaps an anesthesiology might have a subspecialism of what you might call thanatology, let's say, so that the great majority of people working in medicine can continue to dedicate themselves to caring or to curing whenever possible, and not to be involved in this, so that it would be a matter of conscience and there could be a specialism. That might be one solution to that problem. But the question is this: shouldn't we say, let us have a moratorium on, or a kind of retrospective amnesty on medical professionals who have helped people to die in the past, so that we can find out exactly what proportion of deaths in hospital have been the result of some intervention, some conscious assistance to people who really are suffering, because it may well be above the 5% that you mentioned.
I don't know that doctors are honest always even to themselves, and that's no insult on doctors. All of us, the way we remember what we did and the choices that we made, we maybe don't remember so accurately that, we maybe are a little flattering to ourselves. And when something has been illegal, even if you say, and I'm now not going to prosecute it, I'm not sure you'd elicit terribly accurate memories. There have been some anonymous surveys of doctors, and even in countries where absolutely there's just no flexibility on this at all, there are always a few % of doctors who say that they have done it. And I mean, some of the practices that doctors do, totally legally, totally ethically, within the boundaries of what they expect to do in their profession, we don't know about them, and we maybe aren't that comfortable about them, in fact. I'm not sure I would prefer, when it comes to the end for me, I'm not sure I'd prefer to be sort of, sedated because I have become so disturbed and so distressed, and then slip away without saying goodbye. But that's what doctors do in large numbers. That's what they help them to do. On the specialism, I'm sure it'll come to be the case that not all doctors are happy with this. But, when you have a doctor, that doctor is there for you. They're not there for themselves. They're there for you. That sounds a rather hard word to say, but I don't think that just referring somebody to somebody else is really the answer. I think that they need to be there for you, for what you want to do.
Well, thank you for that. Well, let's start with microphone number 2.
Thank you very much for an amazing speech. My question is a little bit from the point of view of the impact of suicide that goes so bad, and then the impact of the organisation, like the police and the medical profession that have to clean up after this, the more severe ways that people take their own lives. And did you look at anything in your studies around writing this article around what was the correlation for the introduction of an euthanasia or assisted suicide with a decrease in violent suicides, I guess?
I tried. I looked to see what had been done, and I didn't find any figures that I thought were reliable. Suicide rates vary a lot around the world, and the thing that, as far as I know, they vary with most is the accessibility of guns. So that's such a confounding factor that anywhere that people can get hold of guns, they kill themselves more than places they don't. You're absolutely right, of course, that suicide is just the most atrocious impact on the professionals who deal with it and the families who are left behind. I don't know if it'll make it more likely or less. My instinct is that it would make it less likely, surely, and that it would allow people to maybe talk to their families beforehand, talk about their decisions, make these decisions jointly. I don't know. I don't think anyone can tell you they know, but thank you for the question.
Microphone 1.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you have experience with advanced care directives. It seems a lot of people are not particularly aware of that option until perhaps laws change anyway. But it's something you never hear about unless somebody has put you onto it.
So there are 2 important things to say about advance directives. This is where, in advance, you say what you want to happen in certain situations. One is, I think they're a thoroughly good thing, and they're a good thing partly because they get you to think about these things in advance, to talk about them and not to be making a decision in ignorance, and maybe to explain what you want to the people around you. And in this, this culture where we all pretend that we're immortal, that's already a good thing to break that. But the other one is actually, you don't know until it happens to you in a lot of circumstances. So I think sadly a lot of us would write, and if I'm paralysed, I want to die. Actually, you probably wouldn't. So they don't answer everything.
Thank you for that. There's a long queue on that mic, so I'll take another one from there first. Go on.
Thank you for your talk. My question regards mental illness. You addressed depression, but I was wondering if you had any comment on other mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, which are generally not transient and can cause a huge amount of suffering. Should they be allowed access to assisted suicide?
Thank you for asking me that for several reasons, the main one being that I meant to mention this, so thank you. I think that we simply have to restrict this law to people who are competent to make the decision. It's not that you couldn't want to die and be suffering so much that we could understand that decision and not be competent to make the decision. That's possible. I just think we can't do it any other way. It must be that if you were to use this sort of law, you are competent to decide. Sadly, you probably won't be in the sort of situation that you're describing. So there's a suffering I can't touch and I can't help, and it's a terrible suffering too. Thank you.
Very briefly, do you have a view about that?
I have very mixed feelings about it. I think it's a very complicated situation because, like you say, they don't have the capacity necessarily to decide. But that said, the suffering that someone with schizophrenia can go through can be huge. So it's a complicated situation.
Thank you. I'm completely in agreement.
Mike, too.
You mentioned there's broad public support for assisted suicide. I think in New South Wales a proposition was put up in the last year or two, and I think it was quite roundly knocked on the head in Parliament. If there's this broad support, but most states in Australia seem to be not interested in passing laws, what are the main roadblocks from getting a law passed, if you can comment sort of generally on that?
Political cowardliness is the answer to that one.
There's just no votes in it for them? They say, look, sure, some people approve of it, but no one's going to sway their vote our way if
a few people are going to sway their votes, and they're the people who are against. It's the same for abortion in the States. Well, actually, less in the States, because now it's become so polarised, there's problems both ways. But generally, politicians devoutly wish this and other difficult issues would just go away. Stop talking about it so we can get on with it. That's their feeling, and it's cowardliness. So you need to lobby, you need to talk, you need to get your politicians to get this one to pay attention.
Absolutely. Mike, one.
Hi. I've been having this conversation a lot with friends, just right to die and that sort of thing, mainly because of Sir Terry Pratchett just recently and his advocacy. The anecdotal response that I get from a lot of people who against the argument is that in countries like the Netherlands, there's a lot of family pressure to shuffle off wealthy ill people. Is there? I don't know how you'd possibly measure anything like that, but is there any evidence to support that whatsoever?
That's certainly one of the arguments that the opponents use all the time. I don't think they have any evidence for it. It's extremely difficult to get that evidence because who's going to know? Who's going to find out? In Oregon, the doctor must actually say that they think that that isn't the situation. I can't imagine how they're meant to know. I would. If you allow me one of my very implausible detours here, another one of the subjects that I've had to write a leader on in the last year is prostitution, our argument that it should be decriminalised. And people who are against decriminalising prostitution, they often say, but people are pushed into it by their terrible circumstances. This is very true. A lot of women who are prostitutes, the reason is because all their other options are even worse. And I stop and I think, well, if all their other options are worse, what on earth are you doing helping them by taking away what they've now decided is their best of their many terrible options? If when I'm old, I'm in a situation that seriously my children want me to die so they can get my whatever measly things I'm going to have left behind me. Anyway, I don't think that my life is so amazing. That's not my biggest problem. That's what I'm trying to say. If my children are trying to shuffle me off, my biggest problem isn't whether the law allows them to or not. It's that my children are trying to shuffle me off.
Because there's a long queue, I'm just going to... Next person. It's a bit like traffic lights,
Hi there. Yes, part of my question's already been asked by someone from the other side. I'm Sarah Edelman, President of Dying with Dignity New South Wales, and prior to the New South Wales election, we actually polled New South Wales politicians throughout the state and asked for their view on voluntary assisted dying, and only 20% were willing to say that they were in favour and would support a view. And the fact is that most of these, or many of these people would personally be affected in some way with loved ones and so on. We're just wondering, is there any way that we can get some of the people, particularly from the right side of politics, which are predominantly opposed to any sort of change in the law, to get them on side? It's a hard question.
God, we could ask that about so many political issues, couldn't we? I mean, how do we get politicians to change their mind? You know, when they in the end, they do tend to come around when they realise that they're on the losing side, don't they? Yeah, we have to organise, we have to talk, we have to say what we think. Politely, but clearly.
Maybe we just need an overwhelming amount of public support and outcry on this issue to get them on side.
We need to get organised and get knowledgeable about this.
If Helen had an answer to the question that you asked her about any issue in our society, she could bottle it, sell it, and boy, she'd be
I know.
rich.
Then my children really wouldn't want to shuffle me off.
Do you accept that the state has some role to play in regulating the end of human life? And if you accept that premise, what should the ideal nature of that role be? And through the state, the courts?
That's such a big question, isn't it?
Sorry, it's huge.
Yeah. I'm going to have to just sort of answer in a narrow way, otherwise we could just have another entire event about this one, couldn't we? The state does have a role, and I mean that's a factual matter. For example, in just having controlled substances, the very idea that there are controlled substances means that we think that there are things that people shouldn't be just allowed free access to. We're hedged in many ways in our modern lives. It's what a society is. It's a collective endeavour that limits all of us for our better good in some ways. I think when it comes to these very personal matters that people feel so profoundly differently from each other about, for reasons that are rather hard to see from the outside, like why does one woman want a natural childbirth and another an epidural? Why is it so obvious to one person that you'd want the last bit of life, even if you were paralysed from the neck down, and so obvious to another that you wouldn't? Those are the moments when I think the state has to really step back as far as it can for everybody's safety. Yes, it can say that not if you're mentally incompetent, not if you're a child, not if we've reason to think that you're being pressured, but really should err on the side of stepping back, because people are just so different. I hope that helps as an answer. I'm sorry it was such a small answer to such a big question.
Look, I'm terribly sorry, but it says 0 seconds left on the clock.
Come and talk
I'm
to
going
me.
I'm going to have to stop you. I'm sure Helen will be around. So do come and ask. Can I compliment you on some excellent questions?
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. And can I say to Helen? Thank you. And I just want to say to Helen that was a wonderfully lucid and cogent statement of the case, and thank you very much for it.
Well, thank you for listening.
Belle's been missing for a while now.
Popular online blogger Isabel Mackenzie, aka Best Bitch 93, has mysteriously disappeared. The 25-year-old has more than 7 million subscribers to her YouTube vlog about beauty, fashion and lifestyle.
Our foremost priority at this stage with this information is to stop the posts. The severe social media frenzy was causing a bottleneck in our highly sophisticated copper network.
Bring our bitch back. Bring our bitch back.
Where is she? God!
Bring our bitch back. Bring our bitch back. I'm really okay.
Subscribe below.
I'm Jenny Wenham and I'm a professional YouTube coach.
How come the internet can find that J dude or whatever from Serial, but you can't find one of the most popular vloggers in the world?
This is anonymous. Oh my God, Derek, stop using my name.
We present to you the Fizz a Bitch Up Challenge.
I'm Best Bitch 93.
And we're rolling.
And we are rolling.
Despite that, I've got absolutely no idea who she is.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming along here to the Sydney Opera House today for what's going to be a fascinating hour of discussion. I want to also welcome the live streaming venues around the country: Blacktown City Libraries, Riverside Theatre Parramatta, the Museum of the Riverina in Wagga Wagga, Fire Station Arts Centre in Dubbo, Casula Powerhouse Arts Centre, the Brisbane Powerhouse Queensland, and Horsham Regional Art Gallery Victoria. Thank you all for tuning in today and to listening again. Thank you all for being here. Our guest today is a Pakistani-born writer, thinker, journalist, a man, of course, who is known to all of you today for being one of the more provocative writers and thinkers in the world today. Tariq Ali has said that the 21st century, he fears, is going to be a very long century. I fear that he's right. We're 15 years in, and already we are witnessing the ripples of the rise of China, the waning of the United States, crisis and chaos across Europe, to the point where many are wondering whether the European Union as an entity, as an idea, as an experiment, will indeed survive. An age of austerity, of global financial crisis, an age of the rise of religion and religious conflicts, the rise of Islamic State throughout the Middle East. All of that we are grappling with, and we are 15 years only into this century. It's a century that, if according to the pessimists, could be a century of terrible bloodshed, in fact, to dwarf even the 20th century. Tariq Ali is going to navigate us through what may lie ahead, the challenges that we now face, and what he sees as the failings of our political systems, our political leaders, and what an eventual solution or outcome may be to try to right the challenges and failings that he sees right now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Tariq Ali.
Thanks, Stan. And I'd like to start by just saying how nice it is to be in this hall again. The festival has grown over the years. I remember I came here when it was first beginning, and it's now being streamed to other parts of the country, which is very welcome. What is the world we live in today? This world, if we look at it analytically and in a hard-headed way, the world we live in this century is the result of something that happened in the late 90s, early 90s rather, when what had dominated the 20th century for 70 years, the Russian Revolution and its aftermath, imploded. The Soviet Union imploded. The old Tsarist empire, which had been Sovietized, came to an end. China embarked on a fairly clever new economic policy with the backing of the Chinese state. And I think it's important to understand that without the intervention of the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party, this economy would not have developed as rapidly as it did and reached the apex today, where it dominates the world market. The big shift in the 21st century, in my opinion, has not been a decline of American power. The United States remains the most powerful country militarily. Ideologically, American soft power can be witnessed everywhere, including in this country. And American hard power is still on display and in action. And of course, the American empire suffers setbacks, but this is nothing new. Each and every empire that has existed in the history of humanity has suffered setbacks. So no empire has an easy time of it. But the difference between previous empires and the American empire is that this empire is alone. For the first time in the history of humankind, we have a single dominant empire This doesn't mean it dominates everything, but it means that on a global scale, it is without a rival. It is without a rival militarily, it is without a rival ideologically. It has, of course, economic rivals increasingly in this part of the world. China, Japan, Singapore, the Korean Peninsula, all provide an economic challenge or economic competition. So while the American empire is still in control, we nonetheless have an undeniable fact that the center of the world market has shifted eastwards. That this center is now effectively China and its surrounds, and from there it dominates the world market. It's in that sense not unlike the British Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but mainly the 19th century, that it was British goods and commodities that dominated the world, and now it is Chinese commodities that can be found anywhere and everywhere. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was, of course, a gathering, formal and many informal gatherings, to decide how the world would be reconfigurated. And what was decided by the rulers of the world, largely the United States, but also the Europeans to a certain extent, was that there was now no reason for subterfuge. What do I mean by this? I mean that as long as the communist world, whatever you may think of it, existed, it was impossible for the West to go on an ideological and capitalist offensive that was rampantly in favor of big profits, enrichment, the entry of capital into all the most hallowed domains of social and public provision. That was impossible. But once they saw the decline and the forthcoming end of the Soviet Union, that is the direction in which they began to proceed, first via Reagan and Thatcher, and then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, turbocharged capitalism, taking the world with new rules. And these new rules, as pointed out at the time, were that the state was to be denied the right to intervene or supposedly interfere with the economy, that privatizations were the order of the day, and these privatizations would not just extend into the traditional social infrastructures of the Western world, but also into the military, also into the police force, also into the prisons. And the purpose was twofold. One, to reduce the power and thus the responsibility of government, so that if horrible things happen in education or the health service or schools or prison camps, it could be blamed on privatized companies, but more importantly, to create a new economic structure based effectively on a radical redistribution of wealth from the poor and the less well-off and the middle classes to the very rich and the reasonably rich. And that is what has been happening. And this is what has created a political system which is not permitted too much dissent. It is this system that I call the extreme center. And this center is extreme for the following reasons. And this applies more or less in different gradations all over the advanced capitalist world, and even in smaller countries like Nigeria or Pakistan, etc. That you have two sets of politicians nominally belonging to two different political parties, sometimes three, who exercise power in such a way that when the people get fed up with the incumbent and remove them from power, the party that replaces them carries on in the same old way till it's removed from power. And so you have a musical chair of politics. And this extreme center, what does it do? It makes sure that no challenge to this form of neoliberal economics is permitted. When it is, those challenging it are crushed and removed from power pretty rapidly, till now using constitutional means, but attempts were made to use the army and carry out a coup d'etat in Venezuela when the late Hugo Chavez was still alive, which failed because the masses poured out onto the streets. In Greece, most recently, we have seen a government elected on changing very mildly, a mild set of social democratic reforms and an assertion of Greek sovereignty to do what was in the benefit of the Greek people, where malnourishment has increased by 35 to 40% since the austerity measures were put into place. A small, modest attempt to change, and the EU ruling elite comes and crushes it, saying, we will crush you if you try this out. And before anything can be tried, the Greek government, scared of even worse disasters, capitulates. I've been very critical of this capitulation. And in fact, a number of economists, American economists, Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, have also in their own ways been critical of the Greek government for capitulating so rapidly, because what that does is remove the chance in Europe temporarily from any other government attempting the same. It was the dominoes effect that they feared. And so they crushed this example. And of course, the result will be, I think, in a few weeks' time, that Greece will elect a right-wing government again, since the last one turned out to be such a disaster. I hope not, but I think that will happen. So all these actions, the way they behave, unify these governments. What else unifies them, till recently in Europe, is the whole idea of fortress Europe, of keeping migrants limited to the European countries, members of the European Union, and new laws and rules were put into place to keep people away. And immigration has thus become a major point of debate all over the world. Donald Trump, no one laughed? Thanks. Said he wants to expel 11 million illegal immigrants. 11 million, just nonsense. You know, various American cities would collapse were that to happen. A lot of senators and congressmen would have a hard time finding cleaning people. So it's not going to happen, but it's the hysteria which is interesting. In Europe, you've seen what's going on. So we have to ask ourselves, what is this migration they're scared of? Or asylum seekers? Two different sides of the same coin. The asylum seekers, we know why it happens. If you go and invade other countries and make wars and destroy their infrastructure, as has happened in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan, where there was little of an infrastructure anyway, but the destruction has been huge, people do things that they don't do in normal circumstances, leave their places of birth, the cities where they've grown up, the villages where their families still live, and try for themselves and their children to seek a better life elsewhere. And why not come to those countries which have made these wars and are responsible for what has happened to these countries? And at last, all the European Union's rules on migration lie burnt on the ground because of one single image, because we live in a world of images. All this has been going on for ages, by the way. Other children have died. But suddenly, one particular image captures Europe. And there's massive protests. I mean, Iceland is a tiny country. Its government said, we will take 50 refugees. And immediately, within 24 hours, 10,000 citizens of Iceland said, we will take refugee families in our houses if necessary. In Munich yesterday, after the appalling, ugly scenes in Hungary, where there is a very extreme right-wing government in power, when the refugees finally reached Munich, there were crowds to welcome them, carrying banners saying welcome. So the mood is changing, but also the extreme right is rising. Don't underestimate that. It's good all these people are coming out. But at the same time, within mainstream politics, there is a drift, sharp drift to the right. And if I can, with your permission, address the same problems in Australia, it's appalling, really. I mean, two academics from universities, different universities in this country, sent me a paper just 2 days ago on the black sites on the islands. And they have irrefutable evidence, some of it presented to the Senate committee, some leaked by whistleblowers, that refugees in these remote islands in Australia are not only being treated appallingly, that one has come to expect, but that some of them are being tortured, that some are being raped, that some who become ill through torture or natural causes are left till the last minute before they are flown to hospitals in Australia, and then one loses sight of them. What happened? Did they survive? Were they sent back? Did they die? And this goes on in a situation where the extreme center is more or less united on this. And you know, to treat people fleeing appalling war situations that your government is partially responsible for creating by its eagerness to go and fight all of America's wars. And the result that when people seek asylum from the Afghan refugees during the Tampa business many years ago to what is happening on these remote islands today, they are treated like enemies. The whistleblower said that many of these privatized companies, which used former military personnel, retired soldiers, paratroopers, I don't know what they're called here, but their equivalents, to deal with the prisoners, dealt with them as enemies. He insists that waterboarding took place, that some were tortured through the means devised by the United States in Guantanamo Bay. Now, if this is going on in Australia, what are people doing about it? And you know, it's interesting that sometimes countries which themselves are largely based on migration shut their eyes and close their hearts to others who also wish to come. And when I read about this particular form of treatment, then it's difficult not to remember the treatment of the indigenous people who lived here for a long, long time. The only right Britain had to occupy this country was might. There was no moral right. There was no moral justification, except this was a large empire and it had found what it thought was an empty land. They all say, empty land, no one lives there. The Israelis said this when they first formed the State of Israel. A land without a people for a people without land. That was the phrase Golda Meir used in 1948. And the same mentality was created by imperialism, so that even the poorest white citizens in imperial countries thought they were superior to everyone else by virtue of the fact that they had a different skin color. And this goes really deep. It goes deep in this country, it goes deep in the United States, it goes deep in Germany and in a number of other countries. And we are now preparing here to go to war again in Syria. We're going to go on bombing raids to win an election. There's no other possible reason. Now, and the reason is that a ugly, unacceptable jihadi group, which rose in the vacuum created by the American war and occupation of Iraq, which Obama himself admitted, we are largely responsible for the creation of ISIS, he said. At least he admitted it. And this group, which is a run-of-the-mill jihadi group, saying things deliberately which it knows shocks the West. But the moral question is this, if one is discussing, not what Prime Minister Abbott said a few days ago, that even the Nazis, the Third Reich, was better than ISIS. Now, quite honestly, I cannot think of any other politician, even Donald Trump, saying this in public. A country which occupied the whole of Europe, which obliterated 6 million Jews, which treated Slavs as a Untermensch and under people, which wiped out millions of Russians, compared to this tin pot group which is taking advantage of the vacuum created and which won't last that long, in my opinion. You remember Al-Qaeda? Well, this group has overtaken it. Remember going and carrying out the execution of bin Laden? That would solve everything. What has it solved? Nothing. So, in fact, thinking about it, I don't think that even Prince Philip would agree with Abbott on this one. So what then is happening to democracy? It's being hollowed out. Because if you have a country without an opposition, where is that country going to end up? It's going to end up, if nothing happens, with a depoliticized, apathetic population, basically letting politicians do what they want to and changing them now again just to keep them on their toes. But they don't mind being changed like that. Because in the 5 years or so they are in power, they've made a lot of money, they've done deals with corporations, they've rewarded their cronies, and then at least they're fair. They say, now it's the other side's turn to do the same, and then we'll come back again. In terms of actually transforming anything, forget the thought. Forget the thought. So I want to just talk for a bit about democracy. There is a notion that capitalism and democracy are intertwined, but it's complete nonsense that. Democracy, or the origins of democracy, lie in ancient pre-capitalist, pre-feudal societies. The Greek city-states had the first inkling of what a democracy could be like, but even then, 2 chunks of the population were excluded. These were women, always excluded till the 20th century from voting anywhere. And the other were slaves. So slaves and women were excluded from Greek democracy, the city-states, even though it was better than nothing in what had existed before, and poor farmers were allowed to vote. And when Rome finally took over and became the big power, Mediterranean power in Europe, the Senate was effectively a Senate of rich men. And this Senate, governed till Caesar's dictators took over. And then we had a long, long gap. And in this gap, democratic ideas came up, and the idea of representation. But actually existing democracy took a lot more time before it came. Meanwhile, capitalism was thriving, of capitalism of every variety. Mercantile capitalism, capitalism of the post-industrial revolution period. And it was huge struggles by the underprivileged, by workers, which started off a campaign for democracy again. Of course, it could be argued, and some do argue, that in England, the first huge battle for democracy was waged in the English Civil War, where the decision of the king to make every single decision in the country was objected to by a parliament of gentlemen, more or less nominated by each other, and they objected to the taxes the king was raising, and this became a huge issue as to who ruled England, monarch or parliament, even though the parliament was unrepresentative. And a civil war was fought over it. And as you know, or at least I hope some of you do, that the first country in the world to execute its king was England. The second country which followed suit many years later was France. And here too, the debate was on democracy and removing absolutist monarchy from the face of the earth. And whereas in England the revolution was carried through by Puritans, many of them hardline Protestants, just to remember the role religion sometimes plays. And by the way, this spawned a whole group of networks where people made very radical demands. Colonel Rainsborough, strong progressive in the English Commonwealth, demanding that he who has the least property should have the same rights as he who has the most. The Levellers, demanding that the gentry be deprived of its lands. So it spawned other debates which have carried on through the centuries. The French then were next to top their king. And through these struggles, ultimately, in England you had the huge struggles for the reform bills, which improved representation, the Chartist rebellions. In France, you had different mechanisms, but nonetheless, again, improvements in representation. And it wasn't till the end of the First World War that democracy as we know it was introduced with the universal adult franchise. That was when women got the vote, 50% of humanity. But they didn't get it without fighting. The struggles of the suffragettes have, of course, been documented in Britain, in the United States. I think Switzerland gave women the right to vote relatively recently, long after the First World War. And interestingly, as a footnote, the first country in which there was a constitution written and prepared in 1919 by the wife, Queen Soraya, who was the wife of the King of Afghanistan, and they were wanting a more radical constitution. inspired by Kemal Atatürk in Turkey and Lenin in Moscow. And in this constitution, women were given the right to vote. Had that constitution been implemented, Afghan women would have had the right to vote before anyone in Europe or America. But it wasn't implemented because the government was regarded as too radical, and the British Empire next door in India came and toppled it. Another triumph for the empire. So democracy has been a process not directly related to capitalism. And another way we can look at it is today. The capitalism which has gone from here to there in a very brief space of time is Chinese capitalism, without any democracy at all, which doesn't seem to bother any of the wonderful civilized countries who trade with it. China is certainly not worse than ISIS. So the point I'm making is that the struggles for democracy have been political struggles. They have not automatically been tied to capital, except in the 70 years of the 20th century, where this was the one big divide, this and others, that the West wanted to show, the United States and the Europeans wanted to show the Russians and the Eastern Europeans and the communist countries, okay, you have free education, free health, subsidized housing, all these demands. We have them too, not to the same extent as you, but we have them. But unlike you, we have a free press in which critics of all varieties, including people who agree with you, can write regularly in our press and criticize us and on our radio and appear on our television. You don't have that. And it was a fairly decisive point, actually. And it worked, and it succeeded. But once that system imploded, there was no need to carry on with it anymore. And that is why, if you compare, I mean, many of you still have memories. I know amnesia is encouraged by the state these days. But many of you have memories. And you remember I remember coming here for the first time in the 70s, what the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age were like. They were serious newspapers. The Australian, of course, didn't exist at that time, so one can't chart its evolution. So this is essentially the point I'm making, that the democracy which people took for granted and knew is almost unbeknown to them under threat. And questions which should be raised and asked are not being raised. I got distracted by myself, but I was going to say, let's take this issue of ISIS. Appalling though this group is, what is the most appalling thing about it? If you look at its brochures, they are modeled on NATO's brochures. I'm not kidding. You know, they say this is how many people we can kill in a day. Of course, we don't have the Air Force, which NATO has, so we can't compete with them. This is what we do. They show photographs of them executing people. Horrible, awful. No question of any sympathy with it. But ask yourselves this. Is killing 20 people in public gaze with a sword or machine gunning them to death and filming it and putting it online, what is the worst thing about it? The public aspect, putting it online? Because if not, how come that's worse than a drone attack in Peshawar? Which kills 56 people, of which possibly 2, maybe, are terrorists, so-called, or members of terrorist groups, and the others are innocent civilians. How come that in the West, this moral question is left undebated and we have absurdities spoken. What is the difference between death? Who carries it out? What is the difference between innocent deaths? That when the so-called civilized countries carry them out, it's fine, it may be unfortunate, but when those we disagree with carry them out, it's unacceptable. It is this way of thinking that I find really unacceptable. And it creates double standards, and these double standards actually create the anger and turbulence which leads young people in many parts of the world to go and join these terrorist groups. And to say this is not in any way to justify the existence of these groups, but to explain why and how they rise. After all, why didn't they exist 30 years ago? They're linked to what is taking place in a world that is being destroyed. The Arab world created after the First World War is now in a state of destruction. God knows what will emerge from it, but the auguries are not good. And one has to think like that, otherwise this particular history, which we're living through in the 21st century, will carry on repeating itself. And the other thing, which will carry on repeating itself endlessly, is the struggle for a better life, to put it no stronger than that. Where you have now in large parts of the Western world, large-scale youth unemployment, impossible for young people to find cheap housing anywhere, huge property bubbles, and yet everything that caused the 2008 crisis is still going on. Australia missed that crisis because of its links, very close links, trading links with China. That's what saved you. But now China's in crisis too. And you're feeling it more because that is how this system functions. And sooner or later, it will give. And I spoke about the origins of democracy lying in the ancient world and some of the struggles which we still talk about. Small struggles, large struggles, wars, occupations. Sometimes you see and hear, rather, the echoes of history in these struggles. And I will just read out a quote to you just to stress that. In Sparta, in the 3rd century before the Christian era, there was an explosion of anger because the poor people in Sparta thought that their rich ruling elite, that the divide, class divide, had become too great. Not totally different from a very different world in which we live in today. But in Sparta there were rebellions because people felt that they would no longer tolerate this divide, and the rulers fell. They were succeeded by 3 radical kings, because that was the only form of government they knew in Sparta. They were succeeded by 3 radical kings who abolished the dictatorship of magistrates that was crushing the country and imposing these new laws. Slaves were given their freedom. All citizens were allowed to vote. Land confiscated from the rich was distributed to the poor, something that the European Central Bank wouldn't permit today because there are laws against it, which is what they told the Greeks, not far from Sparta. And the early Roman Republic felt threatened by this example because they felt that if the Spartan model spread, who knows where it would end up, and they might lose their power too. Not such a totally different way of thinking from the rulers of the world today. And they sent in the legions. That's what they were called, not the Marines, but the legions, under Titus Quintius Flaminius, and said to him, "Crush Sparta. Don't let this example spread." And Nabis, the king of Sparta, replied to the Roman ambassadors thus, and I quote exactly from Livy, the historian of that period. Livy writes that the king sent this message back: "Do not demand that Sparta conform to your own laws and institutions. You select your cavalry and infantry by their property qualifications and desire that a few should excel in wealth and the common people be subject to them. Our lawgivers did not want the state to be in the hands of a few whom you call the Senate, nor that any one class should have supremacy in the state. He believed that by equality of fortune and dignity, there would be many who would voluntarily take up arms to defend their country." Nabis and the Spartans lost, but what they were fighting against was the extreme center in Rome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. We have about 20 minutes for some questions. There are 4 microphones, 2 here at the front, marked 1 and 2, 3 and 4 at the back. If people would like to make their way there, then we can get through some questions. If you could restrict yourself to questions rather than comment, we can hear more from Tariq that way and get through as many as possible. While you're making your way there, I did want to bring something up with you, Tariq, to look to what may be a solution that people themselves can actually bring. You've written in your book about Australian politics that the country now specialises in battery farming provincial politicians of provincial caste with impressive regularity. In all these locations, citizens deserve better. But you've also warned about the risk of alienation from politics and the entire democratic process. We have seen in recent times a growing frustration in Australia that's resulted in quick turnover of government, a volatility in the electorate, the election of minority governments at a federal and state level. We've seen this internationally, the rejection of austerity in Greece and the election of Syriza, the Arab Spring protests that grew up to overthrow autocratic regimes. Do you have faith in the ability of people themselves to seize the initiative in a lasting way, or ultimately is even their efforts futile against the power of the extreme centre?
Lasting is a strong word. I've sort of spoken of centuries of struggle in my talks. But I think certainly if people decide that it's necessary to change the structures of the system or even how it functions politically or economically, they can do it. No amount of repression and torture can stop that, in my opinion, because, it's different. I mean, they couldn't stop it in a few South American countries. It'd be impossible to stop it if it happened in Europe or Australia or things like that. So I think a lot will depend on how they do it. And it'll be done in different ways. Look, the people said to me, so the Tories won the last election in Britain. I said, yeah, they did. But lots of people look at it like this. We won Scotland, we lost England. Because what won in Scotland was a social democratic party calling itself the Scottish National Party, which was well to the left of any of the Westminster extreme centre parties, and which produced a debate and discussion in Scotland involving young people that I have not seen in my 40, 50 years of active life. I mean, 16-year-olds, schools packed with kids arguing with each other. And for those of you who don't know this, the youngest member elected to the British Parliament is a Scottish lassie, Mary Black. Just go to YouTube and put in Mary Black's maiden speech in the House of Commons. It's a speech filled with confidence, and dignity, and it shook the country. I'm not kidding you. Lots of people who saw it said, well, why can't we have people like that in England? And so now you... and now we have a fight going on inside the Labour Party, which has surprised everyone, me included, that Jeremy Corbyn, actually a friend of mine for 40 years and participated in virtually every struggle together, decides to stand as a token left candidate. But they've changed the rules, thinking that this will help them defeat the trades unions and bring in more Tories into the party. So they've said anyone who registers as a Labour supporter, pays £3, can vote in the elections. Well, not many Tories did, but literally hundreds, tens of thousands of young people who liked what they saw of Corbyn on television and radio and said, hey, we agree with this guy. He says that he's going to abolish tuition fees. We won't have to pay for universities. This was a new idea to them because they'd forgotten that that is how their parents were educated after the Second World War. And most of these Labour politicians climbed the ladder and then kicked the ladder away. And Corbyn is putting the ladder up again. And all the polls are showing him on course to win the leadership of the Labour Party. You know, so if this happens, I don't know how long it'll last, but it will have a big impact on British politics.
It presents a real choice at that point that is lacking. We will take some questions now. For the first, just over here.
Thank you. Tariq, one of the things I was very interested in hearing you say, or at least inferring, was that our biggest threat is the Chinese state. And yet, having lived there recently in the last couple of years for a year, I was amazed at the rise of the middle class, the rise in the standard of living, and also in terms of the rise in income for everyone within that middle class group. So can you elaborate why you feel it's such, it poses such a severe threat to us?
Well, very good question. The answer is, I don't know. I mean... Why should that pose a threat? The fact that a country locked into poverty for ages finally made a revolution which didn't solve all its problems. But at least it created, that's one interesting comparison between China and India, that the Chinese Revolution enabled lots of kids from poor families in a much, much wider range to become scientists, mathematicians, teachers, etc., etc. And that tiny base, in many ways, is what helped trigger the turn to capitalism and the new economic policy which the Chinese have put in. Why should that threaten anyone? I mean, you know, they're not going to invade Australia, for God's sake.
You have said, Tariq, that you don't believe that China actually represents
a threat
even to the United States.
No.
In fact, it won't even usurp US power, in your view.
Exactly. China is not interested in building itself up like the Soviet Union did. As a big military power. That's a decision their leadership took very early on because they saw how Russia and the former Soviet Union imploded. By constantly engaging in an arms race with the United States till it couldn't afford it any longer. That played a big part. I remember the Economist headline when the Russians decided to compete with the Americans on the arms race, the joys of rearmament. Meaning now we've got them. And they had. And the Chinese are not going to go down that route. Effectively, they'll be a sort of crude but defensive power. They'll defend their own interests in their region. They're not going to take on the Americans. They couldn't anyway. The United States military budget is 8 times that of the next 6 countries put together, which include Russia, China, whatever else you want to put in. You know, American technology is expanded vastly. The big success story of the United States has been the internet. which has transformed the way everything functions. So China can't compete with that, and nor does it want to. So the fear is deliberately created to justify Australia being involved in these absurd military bases and building up its armed strength and saying it hasn't got money to do A, B, C, D, E, but it has a lot of money to build up its military structure. It's foolish, in my opinion.
I think it's probably also worth remembering the last time China fought a war was 30 years ago against Vietnam, and it lost.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly battle-hardened. Question number 3, up the microphone number 3.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for being here.
Where are you?
Over here.
There you go.
Okay.
Up there in the right hand.
Okay.
Yes. I wanted to ask, with the recent developments that happened in Guatemala just a couple of days ago, where the people were effectively able to demonstrate their discontent with the level of corruption that had taken place there. They're able to basically make the president step down, and he's now in jail. I just was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
In fact, you do write a lot about Latin America in the book as being one of the real beacons of hope for change.
Well, I was very pleased, naturally, that this could happen. And, you know, the thing is that people can learn from these lessons. It's very interesting, but the changes in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, though not changes on the Cuban model, are nonetheless important changes in that they've educated people both in democracy. I mean, the Venezuelan constitution, even though it's attacked non-stop, is the most democratic in the world, where the population has the right. If you get a particular number of signatures, you have the right to challenge an existing president and trigger an election. And they did. The opposition did and lost. But no one else has that in its constitution. So that has had a huge impact on the smaller countries on that continent. And the Guatemalan thing is part and parcel of this radical democracy which we see on that continent, and it's excellent that they've got rid of this corrupt politician. I wish the Mexicans would follow them, because there the corruption is linked to the narco gangs. You know, most of the politicians are also hand in glove with the drug barons and drug lords in that country. And, you know, not to say that Europe and North America and Australia are immune to that particular problem of corruption. You know, there are lots of stories, and of course on different levels. But the fact that the population felt angry enough to do it, that is the big difference with what happens in other parts of the world, that people don't believe in themselves. And in Guatemala, they believed in themselves and their ability to do it, and the repressive forces couldn't do anything. So it's very positive.
Yes.
The convergence this week of the ongoing European refugee crisis, with Jeremy Corbyn being in the ascendancy currently, do you think that he's somehow captured a more global zeitgeist? And do you think that perhaps he could capture the imagination of other Corbyns in Mr. Harper's Canada, for example, and here in Mr. Abbott's Australia?
Well, Harper's Canada is a really depressing country. And even the NDP, which is their equivalent of a social democratic party, has been caught up in all this and caving in too much. It depends on, you know, whether people can transform the NDP or not. I rather doubt it myself, though in some areas it's better than others. But let's hope it has impact. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn in the British press has been called the Pied Piper of Islington. That's where he lives. And the question is, do we have a Wizard of Oz? I don't see such a politician in any party. That's the tragedy. You know, the Greens mean well, but in terms of producing a politician who can speak to the country as a whole, this is one of the problems of the extreme centre, that it's wiped out that layer of politicians who, whether you agree or disagree with them, had something to say. These are sort of confections.
Microphone number 4.
Hey, first of all, thanks for being here. I was wondering about your comments on Jeremy Corbyn, and it really struck that in Australia, we don't really have much of an opposition. Both sides are pretty similar. In terms of global power, what do you think the prospects are for candidates like Bernie Sanders possibly exerting some influence over the American political system?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders' campaign obviously has been very striking and can be compared to the Corbyn phenomenon, except there's the way the Democratic Party functions, unless I've read the leaves totally wrong. I don't think that Bernie will be the US presidential candidate nominee for the Democrats, though a number of opinion polls are showing that if the Republican candidate was Trump, Bernie would win, but that's not saying much, you know. I fear that Hillary will be the Democratic Party candidate. And I say fear deliberately because she's deeply reactionary on a whole number of issues. And we've just been through one identity politics president in the United States whose record is problematic, to put it politely. And lots of people got worked up. It'll be the first time we have a black man in the White House, etc., etc. And I was critical. I understood that, but I was critical of that view because when you're elected president of the world's only imperial state, your color or your gender or whatever doesn't really matter. You have to run the country and you have to run the empire. And that is to be borne in mind. Often, over the last 20, 25 years, identity politics have become a substitute for everything. And I don't think that it's fine if you're an individual, and for individuals and for movements fighting for rights, marriage equality, I'm all for that. But ultimately, it doesn't answer all the key political questions. And people have to understand and realize that. And in Asia, we've had a number of women leaders, and not just in Asia. Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, very hard line. Mrs. Gandhi in India imposed an emergency, fought wars. Bangladesh has just had 2 women as its leaders for the last 30 years. Pakistan had Benazir Bhutto. So if one's just judging countries and continents on the basis of identity, then we're way ahead. But if you look at what they actually did, then of course the result is completely different. So I would just warn against that way of determining everything through identity. It doesn't work, it never has, it never will.
As you point out, as Tarek points out in the book as well, Margaret Thatcher, of course, was a woman and helped author what he calls the extreme centre. Time has beaten us, sadly. There is another session which is due to start in here fairly soon. Tarek is going to be signing some books. You'll have an opportunity to be able to chat to him some more and be able to spend some more time with him. Thank you all for coming along. Please thank Tarek Ali.